Thank you very much, Kathleen. Huge range of aspects and topics. I invite questions, remarks. Maybe, oh, Chiara. One surprising aspect is that one might think that a torso is defective and per se not ideal. Mm-hmm. And what you've demonstrated is high appreciation. I mean, of course, most antique statues were fragmented, mm-hmm. but the tendency to restore mm-hmm. antiquities seemed to be a later one. Mm-hmm. Maybe I'm wrong, mm-hmm. and you might correct this. And I wonder mm-hmm. if that might have to do either with the success effect, mm-hmm. that you can reconstruct things from this ideal torso parts and then reconstruct your own things, or? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and it seems to be that, as I was saying, the fragmentation is something that makes this kind of urgency to study it so palpable, like this idea that the antiquity is fragmented, and that means that it might be fragmented further. So we have to learn from it while we can, and that's the sense of this. What I was talking about in terms of the artist's perspective, of this virtue in studying something while it's there. From the collector's perspective, I think the situation becomes different, and you have increasingly a desire for restoration, and you see that in the Belvedere particularly, and in the collections that follow the footsteps of the Belvedere, this sense that the vision of the collection must be complete. I think that has to do with the patrons and the architects wanting to have control over the full experience. It's no longer good enough to have things out of order. And that has to do, I also think, with the scale of building grand spaces, that spaces that are designed from the beginning to have antiquities. It's not something that, it's not a luxury that people had in the 15th century because collecting was different, it was more casual, it wasn't only princely. Then in the 16th century, you have patrons and architects who want something absolutely idealized and grand to reflect the image of a great patron. So you have to have large statues, statues that fit the scale of enormous palaces that are very difficult to find, or whole statues that have to be restored to get to that kind of level. It seems to be a conflict there.
I was intrigued by a new interpretation of Marcantonio Raimondi's print of Apollo with one of his male lovers. Mm-hmm. And I mean, the Apollo is a kind of Apollo Belvedere thing. The only part that is missing is his penis. Mm-hmm. And so the interpretation, the suggestion was that it has something to do with this homoerotic relationship. And I mean, mm-hmm. if that interpretation is correct, then there's also a sense that fragmentation could be something very negative. And I was just wondering if you might mm-hmm. know other instances where this fragmentation
well,
was
I think
considered
it does
not ideal.
It becomes negative. I think it's a social phenomenon of it becoming negative. The humanists love the fragmentation. The artists love the fragmentation. I think. I mean, that's my because they are presenting themselves as the one who are providing the solution to that by creating something new out of it, or by saving it, or by rescuing it. The fragmentation works in that kind of discussion, but it's not necessarily what you want if you want an ideal princely image. So. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Or,
Sabine.
Yeah.
Well, you showed a lot of examples where the antiquities were inserted in an architectural setting. Palazzo Valle, Villa Madama, Casa Mattei, also in garden settings. And you explained us, and it was very convincing, that is to complete architectural vision, to add highlights, to do it much more convincing. But I wonder whether if there's not also a social function. To put these antiquities in facets and so on gives visibility. So everybody can see that
Yes.
you are the owner of such antiquities. And I think to make them visible could also signify to show that you belong to the marvelous tradition of Roman antiquity, that you are a humanist, that you are able to understand them and to deepen knowledge about these antiquities, and also to insert them in an urban context like Campidoglio. There's a highly political function.
Right.
And I wonder whether also artists represent themselves when they are measuring and studying antiquities. This could, I think, also be linked to a social function of the artist who is a humanist, who belongs also to the great tradition, and who occupies a more important social role.
No, I would agree with all of that, definitely. I think it's that I would agree with everything you say. That's completely true. This the sense of putting antiquities in, for example, facades, where they will not be subject to fragmentation because they're actually part of a building, right? It gives them that kind of solidity that the building is not going to crumble, the antiquities aren't going to, it's a statement of doing that historical and cultural duty, which I think, and putting them also in the public eye. Yeah.
Thanks very much for your lecture. Can we see once more the Heemskerk from Cambridge? So what I find intriguing is, here, that if you look at the picture, he is not in the same room as the Colosseum. So we have this cartellino, which shows us he's before this kind of whatever picture. So, but there is a difference between the personality and the background. Would you say he wants to say, I was there, I was in Rome, and I'm the painter who is giving you a true impression of everything? Or would you say there is a sort of distance he wants to show us? So it's not really possible to reconstruct and to have the whole vision of antiquity. So is there a sort of sceptical interpretation possible, or is it more a sort of eloge to antiquity? Just tell us with few words, how do you see these pictures? So is this painter proud? I've been in Rome, I am the person inside the picture who is drawing, I give you a true impression of everything. So it's, in another way, my question is about the fragmentary of antiquity. So is there a sort of skepticism here in Heemskerk?
Okay, a skepticism about his ability to have actually captured the antiquities
and
of
to
Rome.
restore antiquity
to restore.
in a full vision, and to have this,
Well, there's been a lot of discussion about Van Heemskerk's attitude towards the ruins. It's a very complex discussion, and there's a famous article by Christoph Tönnes about whether he viewed the ruins of St. Peter, not ruins of St. the building of St. Peter as a sort of a ruin, because he had a kind of ironic perspective on the folly of man, for example. That building St. Peter's was in effect sort of the same kind of folly as a ruin. And there's a lot of question about what his religious beliefs were, whether he was taking a moralizing approach to the antiquities of Rome, and I think there is evidence for that. I think that you do see, for example, in his drawings, an emphasis on large sculptures that have fallen down on the ground. And that has a kind of a moral connotation, I think, that, that he is not completely buying the whole rhetoric of the grandeur of Rome. And he's not convinced that he will bring back this grandeur. But I think at the same time you have to recognize that he is there as a guest of the collectors when he is inside their spaces. And I think that a lot of those drawings, some of them were made into prints. There's a sense of there's an awareness that I think collectors were trying to have him portray collections in the best possible light and portray Rome and Rome's ruins in the best possible light. I think he was kind of torn between these worlds because he was completely reliant upon the people he was with in Rome. I don't think he had a fully skeptical point of view. I think there's a lot of complexity there. So yeah, he is in this image, I think, maybe even showing us some of that skepticism.
Okay, thank you.
So yeah.
Prossima Chiara Franceschini.
My question was also in this line, and thank you very much. I know I'm fascinating with these materials, and I always wondered about one point, that we see almost all of this through the eyes of Heemskerk.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting, because why we don't have more drawings from, maybe there is some drawing of single pieces,
Yeah.
but these images of these collections, we don't have those from Italian artists, not as much as those. So the distance, it provides the ideal vision of this intermediary stage of collecting, because it's from the spolium to the proper collection. And in a way, it's an ideal that it's really unique in a certain sense with this fragmentation. Yes. So one question is if it is true. It's the only point.
Yes.
Yes. And so why we are dealing with the vision of one artist of realities that then were destroyed because other ideals took over.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting. And the second comment is about the idea of the overlapping, which is also very important. Mm-hmm. And it's a more simple comment on the fact that the patrons of this, the vigne and the case, were also patrons of chapels. Right. So they have spaces, both in churches and so not only the travelers were mixing, but also the same patrons. And the Alberini, for example, they had this maybe antique sarcophagus, maybe it's a fake from the 15th century in Santa Maria sopra Minerva. So it's really true that there was an overlapping. It's interesting to reflect about what has influenced what. Right. I mean, it's the visual, it's the vision of the statue that has influenced the vision of the Virgin Mary, or the opposite. Right.
Yes.
Thank you.
No, there's both really interesting questions, and I think that you do have references, for example, to particular statues, ancient statues in Rome that were thought to be the best models for the Madonna. And the collectors were competing with each other to find the most beautiful Minerva or even Venus that could be a model. And so certainly, the Jacopo Sansovino is part of that. So yeah, it works the other way around. And the question about Van Heemskerk, there's been a lot of recent research. There was a book that I participated in a few years ago where it was a lot of these questions were hashed out about Van Heemskerk and why he is the only collector and how it's possible to use or abuse his views of these collections. And this one, actually, there's a lot of people who don't think it is by Van Heemskerk. that it's by a follower of Heemskerk. And there are questions about, whether some of these, let me see if there's, the Galli collection here, it's thought to be an integral view of the garden, but there's another drawing of the Galli collection, which for a long time was thought to be just a veduta of the garden, when actually it's two different spots in Rome that Heemskerk has melded together. If you look at the sketchbook is about this big. It's a very small sketchbook, and it's clearly meant to be put in a pocket. So it's a satchel-shaped sketchbook, and you can see how he was using it as where he had space, he was putting down drawings, and he was probably also taking different drawings that he had made during the day and then in his nicer sketchbook assembling them. So how was he working? I mean, something like this wasn't sitting in front of these figures. It would have been worked up from different drawings. It's so refined and finished. And I think it might be that he's trying to think of print designs. So there's a whole kind of technical and complex process going on behind the scenes of these drawings, and you have to be very careful. But at the same time, they are by far the most interesting and, in a sense, accurate views of what these collections look like. And if you read the descriptions by Aldrovandi and compare them to the drawings by Heemskerk, it's one statue's here, yes, one statue's here, yes. You can check that it's actually, they do reflect what these places look like. And right. He has, but at the same time, it's also the actual placement of the figures can be verified by other sources. So, right. I think the question for me that's most interesting is how much he was collaborating with the collectors, and whether or not, the collectors. I think by this time collectors were very interested in drawings of antiquities, and so they wanted their collections to be drawn, and they also took an interest in how they would be framed in drawings. So, yeah. It's not a simple process.
Fabian Jonitz.
Very much for this very beautiful and rich talk. I have two small questions, both related to concepts of, let's say, rarity, accessibility, and visibility. The first would be linked to copies and reproductions, and you started by talking about the reproduction of sculptures and copies made of it, and usually we would assume that the more copies there are, the more this proves the importance of certain pieces and the evaluation of certain pieces. And I was just wondering, thinking about the prohibition of making copies of special important artworks, both in profane collections and in the religious context, in regard to paintings from the 16th century on, so that people wouldn't allow people to take copies, and this is because of they wanted to have something like to keep the exclusiveness of the artwork. If you would say there's something similar in regard to antiques, so the notion of the singularity of having only one executed piece or something like this. And the second question would be, just out of curiosity, you strengthen so much the importance of collectors to have their pieces and their collections being accessible and visible to others. If there's any case known to you where you would say it's the difference, people try to avoid that everyone can enter the collections, and it's again the exclusiveness that only a specific audience
Right.
have access to these things, similar to, one might think of something like the Studiolo Francesco Prima or something, where it's also in these princely collections,
Yeah.
a very limited circle of people having access.
Right. Okay. Yeah, those are good questions and a bit difficult to answer, to be honest. So the first question about whether there were restrictions on copying. I think copying tends to be, from Rome, it tends to be copies made for quite elite people. And in that sense, it was restricted if you think about Antico's bronzes or Primaticio's bronzes for Francis I. We just don't know about other types of copies. There might have been casts, there might have been gesso casts made of things that ended up going to Florence. There's certainly a very strict sense that antiquities should not leave Rome. They should not be exported from Rome. And there was a great desire to have images of them, which seems to be supplied by prints mostly. Whether there were more informal copies, it's really difficult to know, and it seems to be something that maybe the historical record just doesn't preserve. I don't know, like the figure of the artist in Van Heemskerk. Is he making a little model, or I mean, you just don't know what was going on. Whether someone could actually make a gesso or a plaster cast, that would be a pretty big procedure. But maybe if they were allowed to sketch, maybe that was also something they were allowed to do. So unfortunately, there's just not a lot of evidence. The next question was about the, you remind me again, yes, okay. I think that's another question that's really difficult to answer, but you have evidence for people just being able to go in, people who are not of a particular rank, in the collections that are in sort of downtown Rome, where they're off the main thoroughfare. So particularly the Via Papalis, which I was showing you, where it seems like there were courtyards that were sort of semi-accessible. There are examples of pilgrims who are told by professional guides, oh, if you like this, why don't you come with me and I'll take you to the Della Valle collection. So if they see somebody looking at the Colosseum, they might stop them and say, if you give me a tip, I'll take you to some of the collections. But again, these are the collections on the main streets, not the vigne, not the places in the hills, not off the main tourist track. So the Belvedere really does seem to have been a place that people could have visited. There's, there are so many people who describe having gone there. The question is where the social cutoff might have been. And it's very hard to tell whether someone who, if someone had to pay a little bit to go inside, or if someone had to have a letter of recommendation to go inside. There are all sorts of possibilities. There was probably somebody standing at the door and saying, if you didn't meet a certain criteria socially, or, maybe only men could visit these collections. There are discussions of preventing women from seeing the site of nudity. So that is another restriction on the viewership, I would think. So we wish we knew more. There's a great article by William Stenhouse that goes into this and tries to gather together all the evidence that exists on admission.
What one might probably also notice is that at the very moment that when prints existed, some statues became less interesting.
Yeah.
Because Gabriele Simeoni, for example, it's very clear in his description that he wanted to see and draw things nobody else before him has drawn, whereas the Vatican, of course, he looked at the Vatican collection, but he could buy a collection of prints, so it was unnecessary to draw them anymore.
Yes, thank you very much for this fascinating topic. Mine is not a critic at all. It is just that I wish to expose a growing philosophical perplexity. Do we not take for granted that ideality is everywhere in such topics? I mean, when you speak, and you have just shown a picture of tempus edax rerum. Well, tempus edax rerum pertains to a tradition which is, at least in the very precise humanistic context, anti-idealistic, because it pertains to Ovidius. And Ovidius was usually read and perused in an anti-idealistic view of the world, of man, the general decay of the world. Mm-hmm. So when you present artists or humanists in an idealistic context, this is the title of your ideal form, ideal seeing, inserted in an anti-idealistic frame, there is a perplexity, because what is idealistic or ideal activity? Just measuring marble or antiquity in the general collapse of the universe? What is exactly ideal? What do you mean, or what do we mean when we speak of ideal view, of ideal reproduction in a context which is all but ideal? Mm-hmm. You catch my point? There is a paradoxical approach, because I think that many of those activities in the humanistic context have very little to do with idealistic attitude, with ideals. Mm-hmm. This is I confess this is a very philosophical problem, and I'm sorry to to trigger you with that, but you know, what is actually idealistic or ideal in this context? Well, just the fact of measuring the marble in the general decay of in the...
The point I was trying to make here is that actually all of these objects, if you look at them, they're objects that were at the time in collections.
Yes.
And so they've been kind of brought out into the landscape, and it seems to me to be a kind of allegory of what the collection does to prevent decay.
Oh, you interpret it as an allegory of, yeah, I catch your point. But
so,
nevertheless, how do you explain tempus edax rerum? Because it is an antiphysis. It is, the tempus edax rerum means that all this is going to decay and to disappear.
Right, so that's why you need to draw them. And that's why you need to collect them.
Yes.
Because that, if you take them out of this landscape, then there's a much greater chance that they're not going to be eaten by time.
What you are calling ideal or idealistic activity is only the fact of saving, escaping the antiquity from the general decay.
Right.
Oh, I understand. Thank you.
Sure.
Well, I would like to come back a little moment to which said Jürgen Müller, the posthumous of Cambridge. What does this mean? Which feeling is expressed in this representation? I think if we proceed by a confrontation of the posthumous and the Hemskerk, there is a very important difference of scale. When we look to the posthumous, it is difficult to distinguish the architects or artists or scholars or archaeologues who are measuring. They are hidden by this enormous antique landscape. But here in the postum, in the Hemskerk, he is really visible. And I think the expression is that he is very proud to be in Rome, to deepen knowledge about Roman antique architecture. And my impression is that he wants to say knowledge is power. And that is linked to my remarks on the social the function of such representation. He's a very important man.
Right. No, I agree. Just it's interesting that he composes this, in some ways, the way he composes his drawings of antiquities with two large antiquities next to each other. So if you look at his drawings of antiquities, you often have sort of a huge crater and a huge building, which are not necessarily the same size in real life, but he's inflated them. So he's equating himself with the antique Colosseum. Yeah.
Well, regarding the ideal seeing and the ideal forms, I was thinking about that particular case of the collection of Cardinal Cesi, and there he constructed the antiquarium, which you know, and in that he put he created new devices, which were these round bases, and on that he put the Crouching Venus, which he changed to a leda. And it's very interesting because in that way he wanted the viewer to conceive them from the round and perceive the ideal form in a way. Do you know of any similar cases where devices were constructed for these perceptions?
Yeah, those are wonderful. They're just the descriptions of in the antiquarium that you could turn the statues on a little base so that you could see the Crouching Venus from all angles, which is just fantastic. And this antiquarium actually existed until the 1930s, and there are some photographs of the stuccos, and so yeah, it's a wonderful space. And there were other antiquaria in collections that some of them survived. One near here, at the Palazzo del Bufalo, which was destroyed for the Via del Tritone. So these are the kinds of things that we just have tiny details about them, but they must have been a bit more kind of focused places for viewing and also for dining and socialization. So you could imagine small antiquities being in these antiquaria, portrait busts, things like that. It's kind of a lost world that is really fascinating, but deserves a lot more attention. I don't know of any other examples of the rotating bases.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting that it's the probably most erotically charged statue in the whole collection that was presented that way. So sexual attraction seemed to play, or as always, is a very important force and power in these installations. Thank you very much for this intense discussion. Thank you, Kathleen, again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Benvenuto per l'ultima sezione del nostro convegno. Ho il piacere di presentare Filippo Camerota, che lavora al Museo Galileo a Firenze, e dobbiamo a Filippo Camerota un numero importante di pubblicazioni che riguardano la prospettiva. E recentemente mi pare uno studio molto approfondito dell'adorazione di Leonardo, soprattutto il disegno degli Uffizi e il quadro incompiuto. Non so, forse ci parlerai anche oggi un po' di questa esperienza molto interessante e molto particolare, quindi ti do la parola.